Please be seated. This morning, Commissioner Owen read out a statement. I'll just repeat that. In relation to witnesses who will be giving evidence today and in coming days, it may be necessary to canvass material that has been provided by patrons who cannot be named. From time to time, it may be necessary to take the evidence in private sessions. In that case, appropriate orders will be made. During public hearings, everyone, witnesses, counsel and commissioners alike, should exercise caution to ensure that patrons are not named, and in case there is a slip or inadvertent naming, there is a general non-production order prohibiting the naming of those individuals. In case of a slip or inadvertent naming, counsel should raise the issue and the general NPO can be made specific. We will also need to guard against the display on public screens of documents that name patrons. This does not apply to documents that are already tendered as part of the public record and in respect of which an NPO has not been made. Similarly, if the name of a patron is already a matter of public record, the general NPO can, on application, be lifted. So, can a witness come forward, please? Can you please state your name for the record and...
Christo Theodoropoulos.
Thank you. And will you take an oath or affirmation?
I'll take an oath.
Thank you.
I, Christo Theodoropoulos, swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but.
Thank you. Please take a seat. Mr. Futrell. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Commissioner.
Too quick.
Sure, for the witness.
Yes, Mr. Shaw.
Could I ask for documents, the witness statement CRW 998002, there it is. Mr. Theodoropoulos, if we could just quickly scroll through to the end, please, operator. Sorry, yes. Your signature's redacted there, Mr. Theodoropoulos, but is that your witness statement?
Yes, it is.
And I think there's one correction, Commissioner, that needs to be made.
Yep.
It's in a number of places, but it's the description that first appears in paragraph 14 on the third line down, the position of AML compliance officer. That appears a number of other times. I can tell you, Commissioner, it's paragraphs 15, 16, the heading before paragraph 17, then in paragraph 17, paragraph 37 and paragraph 38. And in each case, that should be, in fact, AML officer, not AML compliance officer, Commissioner. Is that correct, Mr. Theodoropoulos?
It is.
Thank you. I tender the witness statement, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaw. The witness statement bearing the number CRW.998.002.0512 is accepted as an exhibit. Mr. Futrell.
May it please, Commissioner. Mr. Theodoropoulos, my name is Michael Futrell. I'm one of the counsel assisting the Royal Commission, and I'm now going to ask you some questions.
Sure.
Largely to clarify some of the things that are in your statement and see if there's areas where there might be some more assistance you can give the Commission. So have you got a copy of your statement in front of you?
Only
on the screen?
Yeah.
The screen's fine. Just keep that up. Could I ask the operator to scroll to, it's probably on the first page, paragraph 10 of your statement. And I want to draw your attention to the last sentence, which this deals with a period of time when you were a table games pit boss, and you refer there to your responsibilities.
Yes.
One of them included investigating suspicious activities you've referred to that. I just would ask you what types of activities you're referring to when you describe them as suspicious activities.
The activities that I'm probably referring to is if there are instances of one player removing chips that belong to another player. And there are a number of ways we can check that, or we could check that at the time. We had our own individual cameras on each table where we could go back and verify that something was taken by a different person. If we didn't have that coverage, we'd always go to surveillance and request that information to be followed up.
So is that a reference there to essentially someone stealing someone else's chips?
Yes.
Any other kinds of activities that you would investigate?
Look, it was quite some time ago, but I'm sure there were instances. I just can't think of anything at the moment.
Okay, and you've made a reference there also to escalating perceived risks to management.
Yeah.
What kinds of risks are you referring to there?
Look, it's just basically bringing attention to the gaming shift manager of any sort of gaming activity that was out of the ordinary or of a large amount of play. They're just general things that we would pass on and just advise the gaming shift manager of a particular person or people.
And what kinds of risks? What's the risk element that you're referring to there in terms of, say, for example, unusually large play?
Yeah, primarily people that are buying in for large amounts of money on tables and perhaps not having any associated play with it, and then moving to another table and buying in at another table and moving away and not actually gambling.
And when you're describing buying in, are you making a reference there to buying in with cash or with chip purchase vouchers, or what kind of buying in is?
Cash primarily.
Okay, so does that involve, for example, what would you describe as a large amount of money?
Well, during my time, I would say anything sort of $5,000 and above. It's a significant amount of money.
So there were occasions where people would buy in with large sums of cash and then have minimal play or move tables.
Correct.
And how is it that you made the observations about that kind of activity?
It's either referred to me by table game staff, a croupier, or who will pass it on to an inspector, or then pass it on to me.
And what step, if any, was taken after you received information about activity of that nature, for example?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, but I think primarily we would inform surveillance and just explain to them that this particular person has bought in for a substantial amount, doesn't appear to be playing. Obviously, we don't have line of sight to all pits, so they can monitor a player to see if they buy in for more, if they're just trying to turn over their cash and without any play. That would be a pretty basic alarm bell for us that someone might be trying to avoid any or try to avoid any anti-money laundering situation. So,
right, and just what were any reports generated as a consequence of those sorts of observations?
I'm not too sure if there were any reports generated. We certainly communicated that to the gaming shift manager at the time. I can't recall, to be perfectly honest.
Right. I might come back to that in a moment. I'll show you some documents.
Sure.
Just in generalities, how frequently would observations of the kind you're just describing be made, during a month or a year at the casino?
That I couldn't give you an accurate guess of what that might be. No, there's nothing that I could really say that it happened 3 or 4 times a month or anything of that nature.
I'm just trying to get some sense of the regularity of it. So are we talking about very rarely or quite frequently, or what sort of can you put a qualifier on it?
I would say somewhere in between rarely and occasionally.
Can I ask if you could be shown now, I need to read probably paragraphs, or just referring you to your paragraphs 11 and 12 of your statement, which are on the first and second pages. And you've made reference there to, this is now talking about the time when you were the table game compliance manager and you're involved in the preparation of some standard operating procedures, or SOPs, or probably call them SOP for short.
Yep.
And also you were involved in the development of an online questionnaire. Could I ask that we call up the questionnaire, which is CRW.701.005.05, 0.5017. And I've got a couple of questions about this document, Mr. Theodoropoulos. So I take it that as you go from left to right across the page, you start off with inspectors, pit bosses, and then gaming shift managers, and each of those job descriptions has an sort of increasing level of knowledge about things they should know about.
Yep.
And there's a common element in each of them is AML CTF. And what I would like to ask you, and of course I appreciate this was some time ago, is what kinds of questions were involved in a questionnaire about AML and CTF?
It is a long time ago, but I think the questions really revolved around a particular situation, and we would give them a B, C or D response. For example, what would be the process of if a person came to your table and gave over $10,000 cash, would you A, request proof of ID to be able to have the transaction go? If the customer didn't have ID, would you break it down into smaller amounts to be able to complete the transaction, and things of that nature. So it was really a question of testing the inspectors, the pit bosses, gaming shift managers of the requirements for the for AML CTF.
I see, and that was how frequently were they required to complete that questionnaire?
The best of my knowledge, it was annually.
And this is an online module,
Yes,
was it?
it was, yes.
Okay. And was that in addition to or part of the normal casino online module for AML CTF?
From memory, well, it's addition to that, yes.
Okay, I notice also in that document there's in over under the column, or actually both columns for the pit bosses and the game shift managers, is references to the casino manual, or sections of the casino manual.
Yes.
Do I take it from that there was, first you had at that time at least, a working knowledge and understanding of the relevant parts of the casino manual that dealt with the pit operations?
Yes, at the time.
And main bank?
Not necessarily main bank, no.
Right. And there you had an expectation that the pit bosses and game shift managers would have a similar level of understanding of those procedures. Okay, now in paragraph 13 you have made reference to the suspicious matter report, table games threshold transaction and suspicious matter report standard operating procedures policy.
Yes.
Can I just ask that be called up? It's CRW.533.001.0908.
Commissioner, can I just interrupt my friend? I understand that there's sensitive information within this report. Is it possible to just confine that to the personal screens?
Yes, you've taken the words out of my mouth. Sorry, forgot to mention that this one will be subject to a non-publication order, so it can be confined to the witness and interested parties, please.
Thank you.
You think perhaps in passing, in describing the questionnaire, you may have directed, already in part asked the question I was about to ask you, Mr. Theodoropoulos, but if I could ask you to be shown, this is at pinpoint 0909, and there's a section 3.1. And there's a number of bullet points. The one I really want to draw to your attention is well, this is essentially sets out the procedure where a person is buying in with $10,000 in cash or greater. There are a couple of bullet points towards the end of the page. The fourth from the bottom starts, if ID has expired. And the next bullet point refers to if a patron does not have current ID or cannot provide their resident address, then the transaction cannot occur. Can I just confirm that my understanding of this is correct, and that at this time, if the person was not able to produce a valid current ID or demonstrate their residential address, they were not permitted to buy in on a table game for cash exceeding 10,000.
10,000 and above.
And above,
That's
yes.
my recollection, yes.
And would that apply? Is it, you'll see there over the next page in bold and in red. We could have that up at the same time, please, operator. This is the top of the next page. There's a big in bold red, remember, no ID, no transaction.
Yes.
Am I right in thinking that was also the case for the cage as well? If a person presented wanting to, say for example, exchange cash for chips at the cage, and they were not able to produce a valid current ID, they would not be able to transact at the cage.
I don't know if that was also the standing with the cage. I can't recall.
Right. There's another element to this I just want to draw to your attention, which is the bullet point just above that large bold where it says if the patron reduces the amount.
Yes.
That's indicating there that a particular kind of report must be completed.
That's correct.
In those circumstances. And what is your understanding of the reason for that to take place in those circumstances? I'm being a bit cryptic for obvious reasons.
Look, I mean, if a patron came to the table and it was $10,000 and did not have ID, we couldn't complete the transaction. So if they decided to take away some money, which fell underneath the $10,000 threshold, we could complete the transaction, but it needed to be accompanied with a suspicious matter report.
And what was your understanding of the reason why those elements or those circumstances would be regarded as suspicious?
Because from that perspective, I would say that they're avoiding the requirement to provide proof of ID, and in itself is suspicious.
Okay. Can I ask that we scroll to page 0911, which makes reference in a little more detail to the suspicious matter reporting procedures. and it gives a number of examples. So this is under the 4th paragraph. Some scenarios that may lead to. And then at the end of that section, there is a paragraph that says this is not exhaustive, and so on. If you're at all suspicious about behaviour, etc., you're required to complete a suspicious matter report. You might recall a little earlier I asked you some questions, just in a general sense, about activities that were suspicious in the game area, and you made reference to large buy-ins, minimal play. Is that an example where you would expect a suspicious matter report to be prepared?
Yes, I would.
And are there other kinds of activities that, in your experience, when you were involved in the table gaming area of the casino, you observed or came to become aware of that resulted in suspicious matter reporting?
I can't recall off the top of my head of any particular instance.
Not particular instances, just types of behaviours that raised suspicion and led to reporting from, in your own knowledge, whilst you're in the table games area.
I believe we received a suspicious matter report from a croupier that overheard some type of suspicious activity, illegal activity. My recollection was it was drug related, but it was such a long time ago I can't recall specifically.
I'm really asking, sorry Mr. Theodopoulos, I'm really asking you about any behaviours that you came across in your time as the table, in the table games area that were noted as suspicious activities and led to reports being made.
I would assume, yes, there would have been times, yes, but specific information about those reports, I don't have a recollection.
I'm not asking for specific information about specific reports because obviously that's not something you can tell me about. I'm really asking you in a more general sense about the kinds of activities that were observed that, if you are able to recall them, that resulted in reports being made.
I'm unable to remember what specifically they were, but I know that they did occur.
Okay. I might come back to that with, I've got some more documents to show you that might assist too with your recollection there, Mr. Theodopoulos.
Yep, sure.
Before I do, I've got some more questions to ask you. About your statement. So if I could ask if you could now be shown, this is on page 0514 of the statement, paragraph 22. Now the first question I have for you is I'm not sure if I'm right, but I don't recall reading your statement anywhere where you describe the training you received yourself in respect of AML and CTF matters. Did you receive any direct training yourself in that area?
I would have received training as a matter of course as being an inspector and a pit boss at the time. Also would have been familiar with what is required for AML, CTF as the compliance officer for table games, and also, you know, with having that knowledge that that assisted me in the role of the AML officer.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions that sort of flow from what you just said. First is you started by saying you would have. Does that mean that it's something you actually remember, or you've got an expectation you had it? you received it?
I can't remember specifically, but I know I would have received.
Okay, and was that from an external provider or was it on the job training?
That was on the job training.
And so at the time you moved into the role as the AML officer and took over the responsibility for that job, did you then receive any additional training specific to that role?
The information that I had already had and was exposed to in my previous roles was a good basis on the knowledge that I had for AML. Further training would have been on the actual reporting side of things, and that occurred primarily with Denise Vanderclough. So, in one essence, we would have the actual mechanisms and the actual reporting that I would do as an AML officer and the checks that I would do, and based on my knowledge and experience that I had gained over the years in all the roles that I had previously.
Okay, but the area in which you had most of your experience, or probably all your experience, was in the table games area, was it not?
Correct.
So did you have any direct knowledge, understanding of how the cage procedures work, for example?
Again, it was a long time ago. I remember, vaguely that we were shown around the cage how things operated, but that's all I can really recall.
Okay, so leaving this to one side now, the training you received yourself prior to in the role, what was the nature of the training that you provided to other employees?
Sure.
And you can break this up into the kinds of employees and the kinds of training you provide to each.
From an AML officer's perspective?
Yes, from an AML officer's perspective.
Okay. I'll start with table games. I was invited at every recruitment of any new dealers or new training of any new games. So it could be a person being trained initially, where I would appear before them and speak to them about AML CTF. Or it could be a person that's already an employee of Crown who was learning another major game. I would always do a refresher course with them to emphasise the importance of AML CTF. With regards to other areas, there was a regular catch-ups with all staff from different departments, and that happened annually to refresh their mind about their requirements or their what they're required to do with AML CTF and how it affects them.
What about cage staff?
I believe I did speak to cage staff as well.
And when you say, is this a direct engagement with them, or is it online?
No, it was, no, it was just direct, actually. Yes, it was meetings.
Okay, and it was with each of the staff or
It'd be
members?
groups of 20, 30, yeah.
And in the other departments, what about the finance area? Are they subject to any?
I can't recall.
All right, can I just ask, call up CRW.008.002.4305. And the first, don't know if this is...
It is, but I notice it's not on the public screen anyway, so
all right.
perhaps if we could just confine it to the personal screen.
So just show you the first page of this document, if I may, which is an internal audit report for the AML CTF area of June 2013. A little down the page, it's got a distribution list, and you'll see your name is on that distribution list. I don't know if you can remember receiving this in 2013 or not.
It looks familiar, but...
What I would like to take or draw to your attention is one of the areas, we'll just go to page 4309. There's a heading, Opportunities for Improvement. And I think I'm right in saying at the time of this report, it may have been at the point that you were transitioning. I think Ms Vandercloud may have been the person actually who was the AML officer at that time. So I think you might have gone into the role shortly after this report was prepared. So this is not directed to you. I'm just trying to ascertain your understanding of what took place following this report. So you'll see there's a reference to the development of a training schedule and refresher trainings, etc. And a little further on in the document, at page pinpoint 4313, there's a more detailed, there's a table with a more detailed explanation of what the internal audit had, or the basis for the recommendation. And there's a recommendation at the foot of the page. And my question for you really is whether you can recall whether in the time you took over and became the AML officer, that particular recommendation was implemented by you.
I can't recall.
Would you agree with the earlier comment regarding the amount of work that the AML officer performed, and that may have been a reason for an inability to continue the refresher training as regularly as it should have been?
I'd be speculating there.
Well, when at the time you took over in the role, I appreciate you were not in the role as the main person for a long time. Did you find in that role that you had sufficient resources available to you to carry out your daily functions and the training?
No.
And is that because essentially you were the only person fulfilling the function of the AML officer at the time?
Yes.
Do you know if you requested additional resources at any time during the period you were the AML officer?
No, I never did.
Did you make anyone aware that you thought that you were unable to do everything you were required to do?
It wasn't a question of unable to do everything that was required. And it wasn't something that, well, from my background, you just don't go ahead and say that you ask for help for a job that you should be able to do.
So you made the assumption that you'd have to do everything even if you were not able to do it?
It wasn't an assumption, it was just my work ethic.
I see. All right. Can I ask that you be shown CRW point 704.001.559, and this is a document no doubt you were at least once familiar with, Mr. Theodopoulos. You may not be familiar with it anymore, but would like to ask you some questions about using this as the framework, because you've made references in your statement in various places to meetings with Mr. Preston, who was, as I understand at the time, the AML compliance officer. And I wanted to get an understanding for the Commission of the way this document worked in reality and practice, rather than in other words, bring the document alive if I can through you as much as possible. So you'll see that it was the AML CTF program as of February 2014. And if I could ask that we scroll to section 3, which is on page 5564. And I just, for the sake of completeness, want to confirm a few things, if I may. The first is that if you look at the third paragraph, it says, at the date of this document, the Executive General Manager, Legal and Corporate Services is the AML CTF Compliance Officer. I take it that was Mr. Preston at this time?
Yes.
And as of February 2014, the bullet point AML Officer was you.
Correct.
And the next role, which is General Manager, Legal and Compliance, am I right in thinking that was Mr. Murray?
Yes, I think so, yes.
And the next bullet point, General Manager, Risk and Corporate Projects, who would that have been?
I believe that was Sasha Grist.
Okay. And the next bullet point, General Manager, Cage and Count.
So it's not on the...
Oh, sorry, here.
Yeah.
It's on the next page. I'm sorry. We need to scroll to that if we may. Thank you.
David Brown, I think it was.
Okay. Now, is it the case that if Mr. Preston was unavailable, that the people who filled the office of AML CTF Compliance Officer were in that order, you first, then the others, or was there some other means by which it was identified?
I believe it was me first, then, to the best of my recollection, that is.
Okay. And yes, okay. Now, could I ask that if we could scroll forward a little more, and we get to item or section 6, and we've touched on this already. I'll come back to this, but this is the risk awareness training program, which is part of the AML CTF program. And then there's a reference in 7 to risk assessment, and it makes reference to Appendix E. And I'll come back to this section in a moment. But if I could move you forward to section 12, which is headed transaction monitoring. And what I'd like to know if you could assist the Commission with, in that table, you'll see there's references to various kinds of activities, and then alongside it there's a method statement, and it identifies, in many instances, report. So if we take the first one, for example, which is effectively a threshold transaction of some kind,
Mm-hmm.
and then report from the psycho system. What was the nature of the report was generated from the psycho system?
I know that there was a report that was generated. What the name of it? I think it was just a threshold transaction report, but I can't recall specifically what it was called.
Okay.
It basically generated any large transactions that I could cross-reference with any threshold transaction reports that should be supplied with that transaction.
Okay. And then do I take it there's something similar it referred to for cheques issued to customers?
I honestly can't recall.
All right. What about buy-ins, carded, uncarded, etc.?
And I think that would be part of the first report that we mentioned.
All right. And account opening and transacting?
can't recall. Sorry.
It's fine. It's not a
sorry.
memory test, so it's okay. I'm just trying to get a sense of what you were having to review each day as in your office.
So can I just interrupt my friend? Obviously, there is sensitive information in terms of the procedures adopted by the casino in relation to these matters, and if there's just a way of addressing them without, for example, reading each of the particular items.
Very well. If I could ask you to look at the number box here. It will be the box 1, 2, 3, the 5th box under the heading activity, and again, it refers to a report.
Yes.
Are you able to say what the nature of that report was?
I do recall seeing that type of report before, but specifics, I couldn't give you any specifics.
Okay. Just in general terms, how long and how long the reports and how much time did it take up in your day to review them?
It'd be the first thing that I did every morning, and depending on the amount of transactions that have occurred, I think it would probably take most of the morning.
So till about lunchtime then?
I would say so.
I see.
From memory.
And then there's another one there. So the next box down, and you'll see in brackets after each of the earlier boxes, there's a reference to monitored by, meaning the relevant department doing it. In each of the earlier cases, it's not the AML officer. Then the next box has a reference to the AML officer, and again, it's a report from the psycho. So given that was a function of yours to monitor, do you know what the nature of that particular item is?
I believe what it was is basically a breakdown of all buy-ins that occurred on each table that was active during the last 24 hours. If people were using their cards to on the tables, then we could identify and link buy-ins accordingly. That would allow myself to be able to see if there were any trends that occurred, like if a person bought in at one table and there was another buy-in at another table. I could always investigate to see if there was any substantial play with those buy-ins. But primarily just to see if there were any sort of alarm bells, in the sense, I think one would be if there was a $9,000 buy-in by a player with no significant play associated with it, then I would lodge a suspicious matter report.
I see. So primarily we are looking here at transactions that are happening within the casino itself. Would that be a fair description? Now, can I ask you about the next section, which is there are a number of sections that follow, and I think this you make reference in your statement to regular meetings with Mr. Preston.
Yes.
And I think it may have something to do with these elements. So there's an item there saying risk rating.
Yes.
And I want to ask you some questions about this, so I'll just take you through them. So you've got risk ratings of low, moderate, significant or high.
Yes.
For people. Then there's a section on know your customer information, which is how you gather information about customers, and that may result in a different, or they start off as low and it might change their risk rating depending on what information you gather about them. Then there's a section on enhanced customer due diligence, which is where you do a bit more investigation, depending on what information you have about the customer.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another section, which is 16, which I want to ask you about, which we could draw that to your attention. And it makes reference there to when a customer has a high risk rating or is known to engage in money laundering or terrorism financing, or is currently an extreme MLTF risk, should cease to be a customer and be subject of an exclusion order issued under the casino law or notice revoking licence. I think there's references to NRLs or words or
Yes.
that acronym. In the time that you were the casino, the AML officer, do you recall an instance where a person was issued with a NRL?
I know that they have occurred during my time. Specific information about it, I couldn't recall.
All right. What are you able to explain to the Commission? What kind of behaviour and risk would have at the time you were the AML officer would have been considered sufficiently high to result in the exclusion of a patron?
I think normally the decision, if there was any suspicious activity, we would receive information from not only internal sources but external authorities. Who would make that decision would probably be Josh. But that's the best to my recollection at the moment.
All right. What I'm really asking you is what kind of conduct or information about a customer would be sufficiently give rise to a sufficiently high degree of risk that at the time you were there, the Perth Casino would decide that they would rather not do business with that customer?
I can't recall specifically what the scenarios were. I know that they occurred, but I couldn't. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
All right. Well, are you able to give some sense of what it would require to move from low to moderate risk?
Again, that would be a decision made by Josh Preston during our compliance meetings of if I brought significant, if I brought threshold transaction reports before him and he identified a particular customer that he was aware of that he might have further information, he might raise that level to a different height or decrease, but it was purely done by Josh Preston.
And were there occasions when you made recommendations to him based on the information that you had to you about whether the person should be moderate, significant or high?
Possibly, but I can't recall any specifics.
All right. I'm going to have another go at refreshing your memory on some of these transaction reports, if I may. So the document is CRW.708.019.3274, which are the standard operating procedures for the AML and compliance officer at the time. Well, in March 2013. We have, I've asked you about a number of these already, so I won't ask you again, but there is one I would like you to, if you can, tell me what you can recall about it. This is on page 3275. It's immediately before the heading fortnightly. And there's a reference there to a telegraphic transfer listing report.
It does ring a bell, but just give me a second now. I mean, I've heard of the report. I just can't recall what it would have been about, to be perfectly honest, without reading.
Can I ask you this? The information generated from the psycho system, was that in the nature of a printout from that system itself?
Yes.
Were there any source documents that came with it? So could you view in psycho, for example, the original telegraphic transfer report generated from the cage, for instance, with its attachments?
Don't believe so, but...
Okay. Can I just ask you then if you can recall, under fortnightly, there's a reference in the third bullet point to risk triggers and risk register. Do you remember what they were?
The risk register was a rather large spreadsheet from memory of all players that were either received a suspicious matter report or a threshold transaction report.
Right, and the risk triggers?
I can't recall.
Is this, so if you look over the page, there's an underlining AML CTF risk register. Is that may be what you just referred to, which is the spreadsheet maintaining information on patrons. You have referred to this, I think, in your statements.
Yes,
at one
I think
place.
so, yep.
All right. Okay, now, just to return to the topic of training, if I could, and I'll just, on page pinpoint 3278, there's a table. Now, I think this may have been, you may have made reference to this earlier when you said you were giving refreshers.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned specifically table games.
Yes.
I think you might have agreed that you did cage, but there are other ones there as well. So there's electronic gaming, international operations and surveillance.
Yes.
Do you recall whether you provided those other departments with the same sort of training?
I did face-to-face meetings with groups of, as I said previously, about 20 or 30 people, and they could be from various departments, including international operations, surveillance,
All right.
e-gaming.
Now, towards the bottom of that page, same page, there's a reference to psycho upgrade testing. Do you know what that means? Or can you explain what that means?
There was a time, yes, I could tell you. I'm just trying to think of an instance where we would test psycho for a particular, perhaps a new game that may have been added to the gaming floor.
All right.
I believe that's what it was about. It's whenever a new game was introduced to the main gaming floor, there would be a component there, AML component, to see if it was AML compliant, in the sense that in some of the electronic gaming machines there was a limit of amount of money you could put into it and then withdraw. I'm stretching the memory here, but I believe that might have been
Okay.
what that's referring to.
I just want to ask you about the next one, which is references there to breaches of the Act or policies and procedures, and there's a reference to taking disciplinary action.
Yes.
Can you recall what the nature of those procedures were and if they were ever implemented?
Well, we'd obviously, and I think you probably will touch upon it later, but during compliance meetings, there was always the forum to be able to address in the group of particular infringements with regards to AML or any other type of breach to policies and procedures, rules and regulations, etc. And according to the severity, obviously, of the infringement or the breach, it would be there would be a determination made of what the sort of the disciplinary action would be. I know that after my time at Crown, that AML was quite entrenched. Everyone knew what the requirements were. And I believe there was a situation where someone in a PIPOS position, the customer did not have proof of ID, so advised the table staff to split the buy-in. So if it was $10,000, do a $9,000 buy-in and then do a $1,000 buy-in, avoiding the threshold transaction report. I believe the outcome for that person that made that decision was they were terminated.
And you're saying this is when you were no longer employed by, so something you've heard about since? Okay.
Yes.
Now, I don't now know whether we provided you with a list of documents and some pinpoints to them, so with the hope of making this examination briefer for you. You will have no doubt picked up from the items to which we draw your attention that there were a number of instances where it had been identified that the person had expired ID and yet they had nonetheless been permitted to transact.
Mm-hmm.
There were references to something called an incident report.
Yes.
What was the nature of an incident report?
I think each department had their own version of an incident report. It would be, for example, if there was an infringement by a cage officer, the disciplinary action would begin with the incident report, which eventually ended up in our compliance meeting, and it was brought to our attention then, and also to the AML officer prior to that meeting. But an incident report is basically explaining what has occurred, how it occurred, who infringed on the either the policy or procedure that they breached, and what disciplinary action they would take.
And what was the significance of IC? So, what was the significance of it from an employee's perspective? It goes in their record, does it?
Yes.
And there's references in at least one occasion to someone receiving a first written warning. Is that part
Yes.
of the disciplinary process?
Absolutely.
And there's references to employees being counselled. What was the nature of employee counselling, to your knowledge?
Again, it would depend on the severity of the infringement as to the level of disciplinary action that was required. If this was something that I can't give you an actual situation where that might have occurred, but if it was something that was a minor breach that didn't warrant a first written warning, then that would probably go down the path of noting it and having a discussion with the staff member.
All right. So what struck us when we read through these minutes is that the regularity with which people were either presenting with expired ID and that being missed. Question is whether that resulted in any additional training being undertaken with the K staff as a consequence of that.
From memory, yes, it would have been.
All right. And what about was any disciplining of the cage management as a consequence of what appeared to be a pretty regular oversight by the cage staff?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, the supervisors and those in charge of the cage, their department had people pretty regularly missing things. Was there any disciplinary action, as far as you can recall, relating to the management in that area?
Well, I don't believe that it was a regular thing. I believe that the training that the cage staff had was adequate. It was human error on most occasions, my understanding was. But to answer your question, I'm not aware.
Okay, what I would like to do now is take you to a number of documents that are the subject of an NPO, and I'll be also drawing your attention to documents that parts of which will be subject to the secrecy provisions under the AML CTF Act. So I'm not going to ask you to disclose anything that would or may result in a breach of that Act.
Mm-hmm.
And it also referred to patrons. Now, you might recall the Commissioner making an observation when we started about maintaining the privacy of the patrons. So when I deal with these, I'll give them a pseudonym and ask you to refer to them by that pseudonym.
Sure.
Having identified the relevant passages or part of the document. And hopefully neither of us will make a mistake. Okay, so, and this is really to try and flesh out a little more with some concrete examples. Something I asked you about earlier, which is in what way were people regarded at certain levels of risk and the activities in which they were involved, to get a sense of how risk was viewed by Crown Perth at the time. So the first document is CRW .708.017.4301. I just need to find my copy of it, if you just bear with me for a moment. Okay, now this is a meeting referred to as an AML CTF officer meeting in November 2013, and it indicates that Mr. Preston, Ms. Vanderclough and you were present.
Yes.
The patron who I'm going to refer to as Patron A appears under the heading 3 in bold about 2/3 of the way down the page.
Yes.
And the first thing is that patron had made an application for membership, PR membership, which I'm making an assumption means Pearl Room.
Correct.
And had 22 instances in RR. Again, I'm going to assume that's the risk register.
I believe so.
Okay, involving cashing out amounts without any associated recorded play over a certain period of time. His risk, I should just say that patron's risk was raised to moderate, indicated to be moderate. Are you able to give the Commission any sense by which that level or that number of instances of what one might describe as an indication of play that is consistent with money laundering would result in a patron being identified as a moderate risk rather than, say, for example, significant or high?
With regards to this person, again, as you can see on there are a number of bits of information regarding the amount of reports and also the world check. Primarily, who made that decision to raise that risk would be Josh Preston. As to answering your question, how he identified to raise the risk, I'm not aware of how he would make that determination.
Was there a discussion with you about that, or did he simply tell you what effectively he decided was going
He
to be
would,
the level?
From my recollection, is we would bring this information to Josh Preston, and he would make the determination of what risk level this customer would be on.
Okay. Now, can I ask you...
Because sorry, let me just qualify that. The play has 22 instances involving cash out amounts without any associated recorded play. It is suspicious, someone buying in. It's an example that I gave you previously.
Yes.
Whether it's considered to be anti-money laundering, I don't know. I don't believe so, because of that particular incident, the reports were filtered through, if there were any suspicious matter reports, and it would go to the registrar. I sort of lost my chain of thought there. Give me a moment. No, having a look back on it, I would say, yes, it would be a suspicious activity for this person doing what he has done.
So, my next question really is, and this is a more general question about matters of this nature. So, clearly, patron A has been identified as a person who has engaged in suspicious behaviour in the past on a number of occasions. So he's known to the casino, he's known to have engaged in that behaviour. From a risk minimisation perspective, why would he not simply be prevented from continuing to be a patron or prohibited from behaving in the way that you'd observed him behave, so buying in with minimal play? Is there a way in which, for example, if it was observed on the floor, was there a procedure by which people would say, sorry sir or ma'am, you can't continue to play because your playing behaviour is not consistent with...
I don't think it's that cut and dry when it comes to that.
Or put it slightly differently, were there occasions when people were asked to leave when their behaviour was observed to be inconsistent or consistent with money laundering activities?
To my knowledge, I can't recall of an instance like that. Generally, when people were barred from, or NRL, they would be due to either behaviour that's not tolerated in a public forum, any suspected illegal act that they may have committed. It could be a number of things, but to the best of my recollection, I don't believe that anyone was barred because of this type of scenario that you're showing me.
Okay. Can I take you to another one, just as another example? This is in February 2014, and it's CRW.708.017.4337. And in this case, because I've skipped over a couple of documents, the patron's going to give a different, not alpha sequence, but if I could ask we go to page 4338, and there are 4 names in bold on that page. The second name we'll refer to as patron E, and in this instance it would appear that the patron has an association with other people who have been arrested by the Organised Crime Unit and are known to WAPOL and the AFP. He, notwithstanding that the world check is clear, was given, or he or she was given, a risk level that is significant.
Yes.
Are you able to explain why that would be the case?
I would suggest that it's probably to do with the links to the other people that were mentioned and the references to WA Police and Australian Federal Police.
All right. Now, the last name on that page we'll refer to as patron F, and you'll see the information in respect of that patron is that he was arrested, and an article was in the West concerning that patron for allegedly possessing $1 million worth of methamphetamine. Now, in the case of this patron, I'll take you to another document, which is CRW.707.017.0352. And again, this is not for publication. You have, in your statement, you've made reference to a Persons of Interest Committee, and you've provided an example of an agenda. This is the first page of an agenda in August 2014, but I really want to draw your attention not to the agenda so much as the document attached to it, which starts on page pinpoint 0205. What have I got here? I must have hit the wrong, sorry, my apologies. I've got the wrong pinpoint. It starts on page 0358. And you'll see when we get to that document that there are large parts that have been blacked out, presumably for reasons of secrecy. You make reference in, I think it's paragraph 24 of your statement, to a register you maintain. Is this the register you're referring to?
Could we just enlarge that a little bit, please?
It might be hard to work out because there's so much that's been blacked out, but you'll see that it identifies the patron, any alias, their number in psycho, their occupation, their aim or risk level, whether they've been barred, risk information, and request for information. It may
I don't think this is the spreadsheet that I recall This is something different.
Okay.
From memory, I think it's like a persons of interest spreadsheet, I believe. I'm not too sure.
All right. Thank you for that. So if we could scroll to 0370. And you'll see a reference here to patron F at the foot of the last entry in the table on that page. And you might need to blow this up if we could, operator, because it's quite hard to read. But there's a cross-reference to the similar information about the news article, and then it has a statement: play has been issued with NRL.
Okay.
So do I understand it to be a notice of revocation of licence, that reference?
Yes.
So am I right in thinking this is an example where a person was provided with a high risk rating and a decision was made that they would be, their licence to visit the casino would be revoked?
Yes.
And is that because of the nature of the offence with which the person had been charged?
I would say so.
And do you recall this particular patron in this instance?
I have a vague recollection of it.
And whose decision was it to give the patron the risk rating and to just make a decision to revoke the licence?
I believe it would have been Josh Preston's.
Was the procedure to revoke a licence, did that require any other authority, or was the AML officer able to do that?
I can't recall if I believe the security manager has the authority to NRL someone, but you're stretching my memory.
Okay. All right. So, just to I know you've been very patient with me, Mr. Theodoropoulos. I'm asking you about things that are of some age. I appreciate that. But could I just take you back to the AML CTF program, now that we've been through that, some of the examples of your meetings with Mr. Preston, and I would like to take you to, so this is CRW.704.0001.559 at pinpoint 5575. So I think, having been through that with you, this may make more sense to the reader. This flowchart, I'm not very good with flowcharts, I'm afraid. I find them a little confusing, but I'm going to try and understand this. So, in this instance, or in these instances, the customer has been identified for one reason or another. That's a big green oval. And there's a question then asked about what the risk rating should be. And you've got the number of boxes depending on what that is. Depending on what decision is made, it seems that it's made by Mr. Preston, at least in the first instance. You work your way through one or more of the diamonds. What I'm really interested in is at the bottom, when the rating is high, there are, I presume, really only two options rather than three. Once they've reached the high, it's not a case of no further action. It's either ongoing monitoring or a exclusion of some sort. Are you able to provide any further information to the Commission or context to where the line is drawn between ongoing transaction monitoring and decisions to exclude, based on your experience?
I remember an instance where external authorities, whether it be Australian Federal Police or WA Police, asked us to continue to monitor particular patrons and not to bar them. That's really the only instance that I can recall where we would just continue to transact and not exclude them because of the fact that they wish to have more information regarding this person.
Right. But it's the case, isn't it, that not every high-risk patron was considered to be such high risk as that they would be excluded,
That's correct.
whether or not the police asked you to continue. But are you suggesting there were some people where you would otherwise have excluded them, but due to an ongoing police investigation, you continue?
I'm not sure if they would have been excluded. I wasn't the person making that decision. I know that we did receive requests for a person to continue to be monitored and allow them to play. But yeah, that's all I can recall.
Right. Just so I understand and I'm quite clear about this, then, when a decision was made to attribute to a patron who'd been identified for one reason or another a risk rating, it was not something you discussed with Mr. Preston. He simply provided you with his view, did he?
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Did you make a recommendation to Mr. Preston, I think the person should be moderate, high, significant, or is it the case, having brought to his attention the information available to you, he told you what the risk rating should be?
He would tell me what the risk rating would be.
And was there any discussion at all about that with him?
In terms of?
What rating you should attribute to the patron?
I would, from memory, I would just provide him with the information that I had on the patron, any prior information that we've already had in our system. I don't recall if I ever gave any input as to determine what their rating would be.
And when was that decision made? Was it made in your meeting with him, or was
Yes.
to your knowledge, was there any policy or procedure that dealt with the way in which risk ratings would be attributed under that AML policy? Put it slightly differently, do you know if Mr. Preston was working off some other document to reach conclusions about risk ratings?
I'm not aware of anything that Mr. Preston would have used to make that determination.
All right. Can I just ask to return, if I may, to your time on the floor in the table games area? Which areas did you work in at that time?
I worked in the main gaming floor initially, and also into what was then called the International Room and then evolved into the Pearl Room, the private salons as well, the high roller activity.
And so you worked effectively in all three of the main areas for table games then?
Correct.
And in your observation, was there any difference in the level of activity you might regard as suspicious in any of those areas?
Not that I can recall, no.
By way of example, in the Pearl Room or in the private salons, was there a larger amount of cash often being used to be used for gaming purposes?
I don't recall large sums of cash at all. It would always, those transactions always happened at the cage, and they would be issued with a check credit, I think it was called, which they would bring to the table, and we would exchange that for chips.
All right. I just want to show you a document, if I could. This is probably a subject of a non-publication as well. It's CRW.708.017.4395, which are minutes of a meeting with you, Mr. Preston, and representatives of Austrac in October 2014, which I think must have been almost immediately before you
Just
left.
before I left, yeah.
Now, again, I appreciate this is some time ago, but there are some things I would like to see if you can assist us with.
Of course.
Under the bullet point discussed transaction process, there's a Roman 1 cage, and it's got CTR, GCR. Do you know what those acronyms mean?
Sorry, which are you referring to? Oh, right.
Sorry, I must...
That's okay.
Yeah.
I think CTR is cage transaction report. GCR. Can't recall what
All right.
GCR is.
Another acronym, BI report.
Business integrity, I think it is, report.
Right. I think I know what IFTI is. And then you've got the bullet point, what data we keep, explained, BI, which I think you just described, TO.
Yeah. Turnover is TO. But BI is buy-in. Win-loss is WL.
See, right.
IFTs are international fund transaction, I think, from memory.
Yes, I'm aware of those ones. I think I know what they mean. Okay. Then further duties. I think TT would be
Threshold
facilitated
transaction.
transfer. DRCT.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Okay. All right. All right. Now, there's a bullet point on the following page on 4396. It's the fifth bullet point from the bottom. It begins, discussed how money is deposited or transferred from outside of Australia. Do you recall what the nature of that discussion was about?
No, I can't recall.
Do you have any recollection of this meeting at all?
A little bit, yeah, but
Well, who was doing most of the talking from the Crown side of things?
it would have been Josh.
I see. Did you help him prepare for the meeting beforehand?
Did I prepare for the meeting?
Did you help him prepare for the meeting and information?
Yeah, I would have provided any information that he required. But what it was specifically, I don't know. I can't remember.
All right. Well, I want to ask you some questions about the process of depositing and transferring funds from outside of Australia. I take it at this time, at least, you are familiar with the process within the Crown organisation.
If I was familiar with it, I'm not now. I can't recall it. My understanding is any transaction that came in from outside of Australia, it would go to, it would be handled by the cage from memory.
All right. You might be able to assist me with some more acronyms at least then. And if you can't, then I'll take you to the document and show you them, and you might be able to then remember. An MT100. Don't know. Okay. There's a reference to income control as a division or a group within Crown.
Yeah,
Who are they?
I've heard of the name, I can't recall who's, I think it's maybe the finance side of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Psycho TA.
Psycho is the system, TA. No.
Don't know. Okay. There's also reference to, maybe this is getting outside your area, a finance / hexagon spreadsheet. No? Okay. All right. Now, just to come back and to confirm something I think we touched on a little earlier, how many employees were performing the functions of the AML officer during the period you were in that role?
It was just myself and Josh. There were occasions where Denise van der Cloud would also assist in the sense because she was in that role for quite a significant amount of time. So her knowledge and input was sometimes required.
All right, and her to use this expression, her pedigree, she came from the cage area too, didn't she? So
That's
she
correct, yes.
may have had a better understanding of that side of things than you.
Absolutely.
All right, I just want to ask you a few questions of a general nature now, if you don't mind. So, obviously, you mentioned Mr. Brown earlier. Did you work with him at all in your role as the AML officer?
I do vaguely remember working with David, but specifically what, I can't recall.
Okay. No, I just mean, was he someone you had sort of day-to-day contact with in your role as AML officer, or were you working separately in different areas of the...
Separately in different areas, yeah.
Okay, and you've mentioned Ms. van der Cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Did you work? Obviously, you worked to some extent with her from time to time in that role, in your role as AML officer. And did you see her? Did you have contact with her on a regular basis, like daily basis?
I would see her daily, but you mean as in specific interaction?
Yes. Was she sort of working in a similar area to you, maybe approximately?
She was mainly assisting Paul Hume with compliance and regulatory matters.
Was there an office where you all were located?
Yes.
And you're all within sort of, sight, speaking distance of one another?
It depends when we were.
Yeah.
We did shift quite a few times.
Right.
It's a yes and no answer there.
Okay, but you weren't on completely opposite sides of the building to each other?
No.
And what about Ms. Kessel? Was she known to you?
Yes.
And was she someone with whom you had regular contact as well?
No.
No? Did you have occasion to deal with her as the AML officer?
Not that I can recall, no.
All right. And did you know a gentleman by the name of Joseph Gerando?
No.
No? Okay. All right. Now, we have, generally speaking, discussed some of your meetings with Mr. Preston when you were the AML officer. Do I take this partly from the answers you've given and partly from reading the minutes themselves? Would it be fair to say that the primary purpose of those meetings was for you to provide information to him about AML CTF matters that had come up?
Generally speaking, yes.
Were there occasions when the direction of information flow was the other way, when Mr. Preston brought to your attention matters of an AML CTF nature that he thought you should be aware of, that he had become aware of himself?
There may have been instances, but what specifically I can't recall.
All right. And what about Ms. van der Klauw, who obviously had been in the position for some time, had a lot of experience in the area? Was she someone who brought AML CTF information to you when you were in the position of the AML officer?
I can't recall. I don't believe so.
Beg your pardon?
I don't believe so.
All right. Now, I appreciate you've answered some questions in the statement dealing with specific names, Riverbank.
Yes.
But in the time that you were the AML officer, did you become aware at all of the closure of bank accounts operated by or within the Crown Perth group of companies?
No.
Is it your evidence that it was not raised with you? I mean, do you have a positive recollection, I mean, by this, rather than simply you can't recall? It was not raised with you by Mr. Preston at any time?
I've never heard of the term riverbank until watching it in the commission meetings in New South Wales.
Leaving aside the word riverbank,
Yeah.
I'm now speaking of knowledge of closure of bank accounts. So whether it was riverbank or any other name, to your recollection, were there any discussions involving yourself and Mr. Preston about the closure of bank accounts?
To the best of my knowledge, never had a discussion of that nature.
And what about Ms. van der Klauw?
Same response.
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, I would say exactly the same.
So you a bit of a hesitation there. Does that mean it may have happened?
No hesitation. I just, I've never really had that much to do with David.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about Ms. Kessel then? You discussing with her about?
No.
All right. Now, at any time when you were the AML officer, can you recall a discussion with any person about multiple deposits being made into a bank account under the $10,000 threshold?
I can't recall of any instance, no.
Can you recall ever receiving or reading in the time you were the AML officer and a SMR relating to multiple deposits into a bank account?
Don't recall one, no.
All right, and just again to be clear about this, the issue of multiple deposits into bank accounts was not raised with you by Mr. Preston at any time?
I can't recall of any time that he would have mentioned anything like that to me.
Okay, now just again to be clear, you say you can't recall, does that mean you have no recollection or you're positive you didn't have that conversation?
I have no recollection.
Okay, and what about Ms. van der Klauw?
The same, I have no recollection.
And Mr. Brown?
I have no recollection.
All right. Well, I don't think I have any further questions for this witness, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Futrell. Council representing other parties have any questions for the witness? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Sadler and I appear for the Gaming and Wagering Commission. Just one very quick question. You were shown one internal audit report and unfortunately my CRW number's cut off, but I think it's CRW, hang on, 008 002 4305. I think it is. Yeah, 5. Thank you. Just a very quick question. Do you know who within Crown prepared this report? Or
I
who?
believe this would have been done by, God, I can see her face and I can't think of the name. Rachel Murray, it was,
And
yeah.
what division she's within Crown?
She was in the legal area, but I think it was more to do, her role was in charge of internal audit.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions for you, Mr. Theodopoulos.
Don't
Mr.
have
Shaw?
any re-examination, no, Commissioner.
Well, in that case, we thank you very much for your evidence. You've assisted us today. We will leave the summons in place, just in case there are other follow-up questions. That's likely to happen, as it is unlikely that you'll be recalled. So you are free to go for today, but thank you very much for your evidence. It's assisted us
Thank you,
greatly.
Commissioner. I wish I could have provided more, but my memory fails me, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
that. In that case, we will now adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you.
All rise.